And now I'd just like to shift into introducing Dave Lacey, the Managing Director of IDCARE, who's going to share some views on identity crime in New Zealand, causes, cures, and curses. So, Dave, if you could please make your way to the stage.
Thank you. All right, just to start off, could everyone just stand up where you are, please? Just please stand up. All right. Now, this involves trust. Close your eyes and think of your favourite animal. I'm only kidding. So thank you, Department of Internal Affairs, for the opportunity to come and speak with you this morning about what we see of people in New Zealand that have their identity stolen. You'll hear a thick Australian accent because I'm from across the ditch. In an humble little organisation called IDCARE. It's a charity that supports people that have experienced the loss of their personal information and have to try and find a way or a pathway to navigate the system of response to hopefully ensure that misuse won't happen and they can get on with their lives. We focus on all of Australia and all of New Zealand from the Sunshine Coast. So for those that fear that your data's going offshore, I'm afraid your phone calls are going offshore. But we do talk to a lot of Kiwis. And so I thought I'd share with you today what that experience is like. So to break it up, we'll talk about the causes, the cures, and for someone who's ever experienced identity theft, who have engaged organisations, and for those of you in the audience who are in organisations that have spoken to people who have had their identity stolen, the curses and what that all means. So we'll unpack that over the next half an hour or so. IDCARE is resourced with psychologists, who are an interesting group of people to work with. I'm not a psychologist. When we did the feasibility study in 2014, we travelled all through New Zealand and Australia, running community events and asking the community if you had a national support service for people that experienced the theft of their identity information, what is it that you'd need from it? And by far and away what came out was behavioural support, emotional support, and pragmatic support. So we had to make the decision early on that if we were going to go ahead with IDCARE and support the New Zealand community, will we recruit technologists in the age of digitisation, or will we recruit behaviouralists and train them up in identity and cyber? And that's the path we chose, and it was the right path to take. And that's reinforced to us every day. Our team is small. Our team is growing in busyness, unfortunately. It's anonymous. We don't need to know who you are to help you. It's free for community members, underline bold community members. It is not free for organisations that experience data breaches and want to tell 30,000 people to call us. We are run by the smell of an oily rag, and our charity, being what it is, would kindly accept organisations to support us financially to keep the lights on. That's the deal. And by far and away, most organisations do not. So we've learned a lot about the response system. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. I won't name and shame, but you know who you are in the audience. That's how busy we are when we look at New Zealand and the average number of calls we're taking each week in the Case Management Centre. We have an 0800 number. We've challenged our psychologists and counsellors and social workers. It is an engagement, it is a case management experience, mostly over the phone. And that requires of those professionals very different skill sets to what they might be taught at university and through their practical and clinical placements in postgraduate studies. They become very attuned to listening, and they're very attuned to listening cues, such as breathing and accentuation of voice and tonalities, as opposed to having a visual cue, where I get to see whether or not you're falling asleep or your arms are folded or whatever it might be. But we are the canary in the coal mine. It's probably the best way to describe IDCARE is the canary. we're the identity system's canary. We get to know who's naughty and who's nice. We get to know who treats their customers well. We get to know which organisations have never thought about customers that experience the theft of their identity. We get to know what organisations are like when they experience data breaches. Whether organisations want to let other people know that they've breached their information on the 24th of December, for example, or on a Friday night, or on New Year's Eve. So we get to learn all these things. Most of which we get to learn about the human behaviour and what identity actually means to a person, and what happens when the transactional self is part of your identity that's encapsulated in a driver licence number or a passport number. What that transactional identifier actually means to a person when it's stolen. And it means much more than a driver licence or a passport. It goes to the essence of their being, of who they think they are and how they think they operate in the world and their role in the society and their belief system. It becomes much bigger than a transaction. So let's talk about the causes. What do we learn about what's impacting people across the New Zealand community? You're fishers. You're certainly active in email phishing, but for most Kiwis that have their identity compromised, they're doing so over the phone. So they're giving away their personal information to scammers. Most of those scammers are originating from the subcontinent. It's certainly the case across the Tasman. For those that might be familiar with the Western Union remission scheme, that was an opportunity that presented in 2018, late 2017. The Federal Trade Commission in the United States with the US Department of Justice settled with Western Union a fee or a fine in excess of $300 million US, I think it was. And that money was to be repatriated to victims who had sent scammers money via Western Union. And I happened to be in Washington at the time, and I happened to be speaking with the US Federal Trade Commission at the time. They just had a recent presidential election. I was potentially a bit concerned that Kiwis and Australians would not be part of the repatriation, and they were quite adamant. They said, no, this is not just America first, this is a global effort, and if you have citizens in New Zealand and in Australia who feel as though they've been scammed and used Western Union, they can apply to get some type of financial transaction back. Within 2 months, the scheme was oversubscribed. Within 2 months. I think it was 94% of people that put up their hand came from 5 countries. New Zealand and Australia were in the top 5. As was US, Canada and the UK. So 94%, if that's any canary in the coal mine of who's being targeted globally, those 5 countries are certainly on the radar of international scammers. And we've done a little bit of work with Microsoft, who I'm keen to meet at the session later on today, in understanding what they're seeing of this issue, because obviously telephone remote access scams are part of their methodology, where they'll ring up and they'll say you've got a virus on your device, or better still, you might be searching online how to install Norton or McAfee or Kaspersky, and up comes a pop-up saying, I'm Norton, I'm McAfee, and I'm Kaspersky. I understand you're looking to install me. Call this number and we'll help you. The most successful scammers today are those that are able to intervene within a decision you are trying to make. It's not the scammers that call you out of the blue and say, you've got an inheritance. It's those scammers that can get into the decision-making process because it's plausible. So we see those that are most successful are those that intervene within what we call plausible deception. So in Australia, we have the Department of Human Services. It has an online system called MyGov. It uses 2-factor authentication, which means you put in a username and a password, and then you might receive a text message to say, here's the code. So 2FA is pretty good, right? It's a recommended form of additional security. Most data breaches involving business email compromise kind of wish they had 2FA. That's one way to prevent these things. But the crooks have got onto that. So the crooks have said, well, okay, I'm going to impersonate your government agency and the phone number that sends those messages, so that when I broadcast a message to you impersonating Inland Revenue or DIA or whoever it might be, it will go into the legitimate communication string. And you'll go, that message, oh, that's from DIA, because I can see all the other messages from DIA. And that's plausibility. And we see a huge jump in the success for scammers when that occurs. So it's probably unsurprising that we see telephone scams really being the number one way of which New Zealanders forego their identity credentials, whether it be their IR number, their driver licence number, their passport details, their banking information, whatever it might be. Phishing is still there or thereabouts on the other side of the Tasman. Unknown is much more prevalent in Australia than in New Zealand. So you are a much more knowing community. I don't know what that means. So unknown means I have no idea how the criminal got my personal information, but I'm experiencing the misuse of it. Because there's two parts to this jigsaw puzzle. There's I'm going to steal your information, and then I'm going to misuse it. There's always two parts to the equation. So what you're looking at here is how it's stolen. So those that have experienced unknown means that I don't know how it was compromised, I just know that I'm getting bills in the mail that ain't mine. So here's some fun facts. 72.6% of New Zealanders over that period of time are in direct communication with the criminal. 76.6% of persons responsible for stealing identity information are not here. They're throwing grenades from afar. And that's very similar to what we see across the Tasman. 1 in 10 Kiwis to experience identity theft have no idea where the criminal got their personal information. That's the unknown. In Australia, last month, that was around 40%. 40%. And that has a very different impact on the person. So for those that are unfortunate enough to be in the unknown bucket, their behavioural response is often very distinct. So they're scratching their brain going, was it that I agreed to those terms and conditions? Was it something I did? Have I not got antivirus on my device? Has my mail gone missing? They're forever guessing. And the reality is they probably had nothing to do with it. Around half of New Zealanders impacted by identity theft reside in one of 50 postcodes. But that's probably true of most of the population distribution of this country. So we see those that are impacted by identity theft pretty much mirror the population distribution of New Zealand, as we do across the other side of the ditch. So how do people find out? The vast majority, more than 8 out of 10, self-detect. They don't rely on a bank, they don't rely on police, they don't rely on a credit bureau, they don't rely on debt collectors to tell them. They find out themselves. And often it's from an indicator of misuse. So it could mean that my mobile phone stops working because someone has ported that mobile phone number to another carrier without my blessing in order to intercept my text messages. It's quite a common thing. It might mean that I'm getting a bill in the mail to say, congratulations on a new personal loan. It might mean that I can't get into my emails because someone's just changed my password. So these are self-detection measures that occur. I just was involved in a national review of identity security for the Australian government over the last 6 months. And what became apparent with that review is that still, some years on, organisations don't tend to tell customers when they're aware their identity is stolen. So even though most Kiwis and most Australians self-detect, it doesn't mean they're necessarily within the system the first to know that their identity has been stolen and misused. So there's no law in this land, or there's no law in Australia that says, as an organisation, thou shalt tell Nigel that you've just detected his identity's been stolen. Okay. I mean, why would you? What are you going to do about it? So we'll get to that. So what is actually being stolen? We're talking about identity or identification documents or attributes or PII or whatever you want to call it. The number 1 and 2, passport information, driver licences. I was asked yesterday on a radio program, how many identity credentials do you need to steal an identity and misuse it? One, all I need is your licence or your passport, and that's why they're the most common. So in a way, how government and business, what reliance or frameworks that you put in place around identity, it creates the value for the criminal. There's certainly a school of thought that says it's the user that's sharing their details everywhere that's at fault, but I'd argue a different angle. If you place a value as an institution on a passport by way of verification, or a licence, or in Australia a Medicare card, or whatever it might be, then that creates immediately a value for the criminal, because that value is all about access. Okay. So we see unnecessarily, I guess unsurprisingly there, licences and passports are number 1 and 2, and credit card details number 3, very close to bank account information. Mobile phone, banking and driver licence details are often used in combination. So we'll often see misuse result in the porting of mobile phones and the accessing of banking, of financial products. So what do we know about targeted credentials? In New Zealand, you have a twin-track identity economy. In Australia, we have aspirations to have a twin-track economy. What does that mean? It means that as a citizen, I can get a digital identity. I can still transact using physical forms of identity information. So you have a twin-track. What we've observed in this community, as we observe in other places around the world where there's a twin track, the crooks will typically still preference the traditional identity system over the digital system. There will become a tipping point where where you have a greater body or mass in the digital environment attracting criminals in that space, but we're yet to see it here. And we're certainly yet to see it across the Tasman. What we have certainly seen is the exploitation of digital identities, don't get me wrong, but not on a scale that we see within the traditional identity system sense. Those credentials that are targeted are those that provide access. That's a very basic conclusion. On average, those in New Zealand that experience the theft of their identity will typically have 3.4 credentials or attributes stolen. Won't just be one. Although we know just one is all you require. Combinations matter too, so too the intentions of the criminals. So when you think about what that compromise scenario is like, you see there a mix of what you might assume to be identity theft events, such as phishing emails, but also what enters the fray are scams. So employment scams and investment scams, relationship scams, they're the 3 most impactful events that we deal with on the person. So it takes, on average, someone involved in a relationship scam around 347 days to detect. It takes the criminal 37 days to convince that person to give them money. Okay. So you can understand why a relationship scam becomes quite traumatic for the person. Employment scams, very different. So relationship scams, we tend to look at people that are aged 45 years and older are the most represented. Employment scams are those 25 years and under. So employment scams here, there'll be an ad posted on a website, says flexible working hours, no experience needed, administrative position, bonus pay, perfect for a person who's wanting to get in the workforce into finance and business. They're deliberately targeting people who have not got any experience in the workforce, particularly in administration. They have their first day at work. That first day involves having a chat to their new boss via WhatsApp or Skype without the audio or video. They'll ask to receive money into their own bank account, repay an executive for their travel overseas by withdrawing that money from their bank account but keeping 5% as their commission, and then through another bank account transfer that money overseas. And they get home and mum and dad sitting around the table going, "How's your first day at your new job?" "Yeah, great, what did you do?" "Oh, I just transferred some money." "Oh, how did you do that?" "Oh, they transferred money into my account. I did this and I did that." And mum and dad go, "The world doesn't work that way." And so quite often we'll have mum and dad call IDCARE because they're absolutely terrified that their son or daughter has been involved in laundering money on behalf of organised crime, which is exactly what they've done. Now, for $5,000, organised crime won't come to New Zealand. For $1 million, they will. And we have had people with $1 million put into their personal account. There's no playbook for an organisation when a customer confronts and says, I've got $30,000 that I think has been sent to me by organised crime offshore, what should I do with it? And we get to measure the response around that, because we ask our clients, well, what did the bank recommend, or what did the government agency recommend? And the more responsible ones will say, talk to police, or return the money, send it back, block all communications. The more irresponsible ones will say, blow it all on hats, which happens. So response, which we'll get to, which is more a curse than anything, is quite weird and wonderful when it comes to these types of scams. So what does misuse look like? What happens next? What are we actually trying to protect identities from? There's another way of saying that. You'll see the vast majority there are related to financial products. So you'll see there's access to bank accounts. I want funds now. I'm going to transact and transact quick. I'm looking at debit, credit card access, submitting fraudulent tax returns, sending unauthorised emails, setting up new phone accounts. For most Kiwis that experience identity theft, it's just not one event. It comes in packs, and it can sustain over months and in some cases years. What's interesting there is that you'll see, yes, it's predominantly focused on the finance industry, but to get to that point involves the enabling activity of many other industries and sectors. So employment scams work because employment agencies post the jobs on behalf of scammers. They're dependent on that. Investment scams work because Facebook posts investment opportunities on cryptocurrencies. By far and away, that is the most common channel that ads run by scammers appear. What we're focused on as a community often is, how could the bank let that happen? But there's about 5 or 6 other legitimate organisations who've actually played a role to get to that point who we don't hear about. So when we're talking about systems of identity, I think I challenge everyone in this room to think more broadly about what that system actually looks like. But when we're talking about identity theft, we're really focused about how do we prevent this stuff from happening. It's not linear. IDCARE is not a response service the way you think it is. Most of the response we provide is all about preventing that. So you could argue it's a prevention service. It's also about tidying up what's happened that they might have found out about that they didn't know it was happening. They're the industries that are being targeted. So you'll see there as the last point of embarkation, if you like. Again, I caution government. I think government is largely underrepresented there. Unless policies change in New Zealand, government agencies tend to not tell people when their identity has been suspected of being misused. Now, here's some more fun facts. So that figure there is actually more than the proposed penalty under the data breach bill that your country is proposing at the moment, which I think is a $10,000 fine. So on average, misuse costs Kiwis more than what you're proposing will be the fine for a data breach, which we find extraordinary. Average time taken for that consumer to respond is 25.3 non-consecutive hours. So Nigel spoke about friction. This is friction central, right? They will make, on average, 17 phone calls. They will write about 15 emails. They'll cross around 13 different organisations over 4 weeks. That's your lot in life as a victim of identity theft in this country. And 1 in 3 will experience more than one misuse event. So additional crimes to come from it. So what are the cures? On a positive note, trust me, if anyone can do anything, you can do it. All right, particularly in this country. You're small enough to do this. It takes 6.7 days on average for a New Zealander's identity to be misused once it's been stolen. It takes about 18.9 days to detect it. All right, so you can see we want to shift those numbers around, right? If an organisation has a detection point, the detection notification timeframe jumps to 36 days. But again, that's not the major channel of detection. Remember, self-detection was about 80%. Types of compromise events influence both the detection point and the timeframe. So 287 days, there you go, was the relationship scams for New Zealand. It was 347 days for both countries. Australians are obviously a bit slower on the uptake. Or more in love. So what are we trying to avoid? Here's some more fun facts. 77.6% of identity misuse experienced by New Zealanders could have been prevented if the consumer had prior warning. So scarily, around 1 in 5 misuse events you have no prevention for. All right. So we cannot avoid mail redirection. We cannot avoid establishment of transaction accounts. We can't avoid providing false statements to police or avoiding traffic infringement. I shouldn't be giving you ideas here, but these are the things that can't be avoided. Or unauthorised mobile phone porting or establishment of fake accounts. So when people come to us and they go, what's going to happen next and what can I do to prevent it? Obviously we can talk about the 77.6%, but we talk to people about how you're going to detect the 22% and then undo what's done if that occurs. And this changes. This is not static. Every week we learn new stuff. You know, we have a little thing on our case log that says interesting case. So I'm working on 3 interesting cases at the moment. Often we'll meet each week as a group, we'll talk about our cases, and we'll talk about the hard nuts, things that we don't see before or we don't have a response for. So I have a person in Sydney, a couple now, and a gentleman in Melbourne whose licences are being misused to avoid traffic infringements in France. So we've solved that problem. And they're getting multiple fines. The gentleman in Sydney started to get his, and then I think a week later, his wife got one. And they've never both shared their driver licence details in the one place that they can think of. So they're both in the category of, I have no idea how they got my details. None have been to France. The gentleman in Melbourne is getting married in Greece. So he's really concerned that when he lands in Greece, he's going to be arrested. So this is kind of the hard cases. So we're working with what will hopefully be a good response from the federal police and the French authorities. So we rang the French consulate in Melbourne. Said, go talk somewhere else. We rang the local police and they went. We rang the driver licence issuing authority and they said, I don't know. So we tried 3 stops and then we went to the federal police who have the international network to try and get into France to work out what's going on there. Right, so it is problematic. We have a bunch of other interesting cases. Traffic infringements is not just challenged internationally, it's also challenged domestically. Often they're ones that go to court. So you hear people that have their identity stolen will go to court because something bad's happened. Often they're in that bucket for some reason. So it's all about you as a victim having to prove that you actually weren't driving that car, that you were somewhere else, to provide evidence. So we'll talk about that now. So the curses. So we're blessed to have some good relationships across academia. One of the relationships that we've maintained is with the University of the Sunshine Coast and their cyber investigations and forensics area. And we've been lucky enough to sponsor a master's student, and she's just about complete on writing her research paper, her thesis. Megan is her name, and she's a brilliant student. She followed the journey of 211 individuals across Australia and New Zealand over 12 months post the theft of their identity. That was her research, was trying to understand in a longitudinal way what was the response system actually like, the journey for these people. She received, obviously, the specialist support from the counsellors and case managers of IDCARE with the consent and blessing of the clients, who completely up to them whether they participated. Each experienced identity theft that mirrored the population experience of identity theft. We want to get kind of a half representative sample, if you like. So there are more telephone scam victims and relationship scams as an example. It was kindly funded by the Australian Criminology Research Grant Scheme, and she applied a human factors method. Human factors is a really interesting discipline that looks at merging the human with the technology, with the process, and understanding what those dynamics are. And it's been used a lot to build out nuclear reactor control rooms and air traffic control, rarely used at all in this space. So we wanted to use a methodology called EAST, or Event Analysis of the Systemic Teamwork, which created or allowed us to map the networks at play in the response system. So we looked at the task network, what tasks need to be performed once an identity is stolen, what the information network was, what information needs to be passed to those actors in order to complete their tasks, and the social network, who's actually in the network. So EAST allows you to do that, and it brings it together into what we call a network of networks. So your curse kind of looks like this. So a response system in New Zealand, as it is in Australia, very similar, very, very similar, except you don't have states here, thank God. I mean, you don't have states here. Very high dependency on the individual victim to perform across the system repetitive tasks, including disclosing, ironically, the same information that's just been stolen, and ironically, in most cases, the same way of which was stolen. So there's a re-victimisation that occurs. Many respondents felt that during the period. What we found really super interesting was that there was 63 tasks in the identity theft response system in Australia and New Zealand, 63 tasks, and the poor victim has to perform 45 of them. So your response system is completely and utterly dependent on that victim to do the heavy lift. That's the friction. The passage of information across the system, we had 37 information sharing activities, again, 29 of them, up to you, victim. So it's the first time we've ever mapped it. It's the first time we've ever looked at it over 12 months, and it's the first time we've really understood what goes on in the system. We had the benefit of talking to the victim, but we also had the benefit of IDCARE's insights into the organisations and their behaviour, and what we call response plans. How do they respond to each scenario? What we also found was 14% did not follow their response plan. There might have been some bias involved in that, or confidence. But the primary reason was they felt it was too onerous, particularly in engaging with credit reporting bureaus. There's very high friction. So in that environment, it's typically a B2B relationship. It's not a business to customer relationship. They're not geared towards that. 1 in 4 respondents indicated that they were still experiencing ongoing issues 12 months on. So identity theft, as you would know, it's not like somebody pinches your car and you find your car somewhere in some remote location with its stereo missing. When someone pinches your identity information, you don't get it back. So there's always this lingering doubt as to what's going to happen in the future. 15% of all clients were still trying to investigate and recover their financial losses 12 months on. Just over 1 in 3 indicated that they'd experienced other compromise events in the first 12 months, mostly relating to data breaches, so which heightened them further. 13% of individuals received notification of further misuse. So it's a long game. When people call us, we don't say this thing's going to be resolved today, but be prepared to be in the long game with this. So when we engage people, we ask them who they've engaged before us, we ask them what that experience was like, we ask them whether they'd remain a customer, we'd ask them how they can improve. We get funding for our charity because we provide insights back to organisations who then fund to keep the charity going. That's kind of the business model. So that's why we get a bit shitty when organisations refer 30,000 people to us without paying a cent, because it costs us. I don't want to belabour that point, but I'll belabour that point, particularly in the legislation environment that you're going to head into. So hard to read, but this is what pisses people off. Most customers get annoyed when they're engaging organisations around identity theft, when they're engaging the organisation that their identity is being misused with. And they can't believe how easy it was for their identity to be misused with their organisation. And when you think through that, you think, well, that's an inevitable conclusion they're going to come to, because you're, as an organisation, going to ask them to jump through a lot more hoops as a victim than you would through a normal transaction. So they're going, you mean to say a crook can do this, but you need me to now do this? Right? So that's a kind of understandable experience. How long it took for them to respond to the initial report, difficulty reaching the fraud department, I'll come back to that. They didn't feel the action that was taken or the controls that were offered were appropriate. So big advice for organisations heading into data breach land, don't ever assume you're the only responder. When someone's notified of their personal information has been breached or stolen, they're the responder. And they're going to do things that you don't anticipate. And really, why wouldn't they? It's their information. So what I've observed of data breach incident responses is where things don't work well is where incident responders think they're the only incident responders around. The person who's impacted will want to respond. And what we're finding with identity theft victims is that they're becoming quite discerning on how well organisations behave. This notion of difficulty in reaching a fraud department, most people that have their identity stolen that need to talk with a large organisation, because most of the footprints of misuse and compromise involve large organisations, feel that they need to jump this big fence to get into the organisation. They're not ringing a customer service channel as a normal customer wanting a service. They're a victim of a crime. So in their own minds, they're thinking they're different because they are. And so it's a big psychological barrier for them to get over customer service land and get into what they think is the fraud department. Whether it's the fraud department, who cares? It's just not normal customer service land. And that's where a lot of friction takes place. So we advocate for organisations that do experience a lot of people ringing them saying my identity's been compromised to think about what channels they offer for those individuals to get through. So let's do a few quotes. Now again, I'm not going to name names, so it's okay. So this is what people have said over the last month. This is just the last month. Probably by inference, I don't need to name names on this one. So here's someone who wants to report a crime and having done so feels like they want to commit suicide. This is a very common response. It's someone else's responsibility in the system. Who carries the debt is often a very vexed question. So for romance, investment, employment, well, not so much employment, but telephone scams, if you're paying money, often the individual wears it. If your identity is then misused to get a personal loan, often the financial institution will wear it. But consumers don't know that. So you'll read into these comments that identity is more than just this transactional number. And blame attribution is quite an interesting phenomenon in this space. In Australia, for some reason, the government keeps using smart. Stay smart online. Money's smart. They're equating this to intelligence. I can tell you hand on heart, it's got nothing to do with intelligence. It's got nothing to do with stupidity. People, sure, feel stupid. But when plausible deception occurs, they are getting so good now. They are so good at what they do. There's some groups who are ringing this country and Australia who have over 5,500 people working for them. And all they do is scams every day. So happy to take questions. But I leave you with this point. Your country is small enough that you can make a difference, a huge difference. And it doesn't cost a lot. at all. You know, when a breach occurs, and we say to breached organisations that want IDCARE to assess whether something's harmful, we say you've got an opportunity. This is either going to be reputationally damaging for your organisation or reputationally enhancing. And it's how you approach it that makes the difference. Happy to take questions. Thank you. All right. Why do we put the onus on the victim rather than the organisation that accepted identity documents without effective procedures to ensure it's the right person? Most transactions that organisations deal with are not fraudulent. So of course they're going to gear themselves towards servicing that clientele. So then you'd expect there to be greater friction for the individual. That's just how it is. There's no mechanism in Australia or New Zealand at the moment that says, my name's Dave Lacey, I've had my identity stolen, can you make sure the system knows that? So that when I engage with the system, they might ask me some more questions. And I'm happy with that as a consumer. So when we ask our clients, well, what do you think's needed that's not there? That is the most common response we get. But that brings into play all sorts of privacy considerations. And it freaks organisations out. Is there a typical profile of common personal attributes you observed in ID theft targets, in ID theft? No, it depends on the compromise. So for relationship scam clientele, it is typically those that are 45 plus. We find there is a very distinct relationship between people that fall for relationship scams and having a significant life event occur just prior to. Whether it be a death of somebody, a separation, kids have moved out of home, you've lost your job, is something that often precedes. Now the crooks don't know that, but the crooks know that they're ripe for the picking. Investment scammers, again, typically older cohort, and cryptocurrency seems to be all the rage, or crypto investments, and using social media to promote that. And Shark Tank and other celebrity endorsements without the celebrities really knowing it. Telephone scams is free for all. You know, most people that have their identity stolen are aged between 25 and 48 years. And we think that's the reason why that's the case is they're the most prolific transactors in the economy, whether it be digitally or online or offline. What is the gold standard companies plus new digital identity projects need to be aiming for? It's hard to respond to that in a minute. I think the best starting point is to really think through what your standards will mean in terms of incentivising or placing a value on particular attributes or transactions or credentials, and understanding that properly. Is there a typical problem? What happened in the call centre spike and sudden drop that occurred around June, July 2018? It seems so long ago. Hard to know. About 8% of our workload comes from New Zealand. So 90-odd% doesn't. It's happening across the Tasman or other places around the world. We have about 5% that call us from other countries. I think there was a data breach that would have spiked that one. We've had quite a few data breaches. We're dealing with about 5 data breaches a week at the moment. And for those that have aspirations of becoming data breach incident responders, if you want to age 10 years in 12 months, go for it. If you were to get us... Oh, I lost that one. Where's that gone? Oh, here we go. How many organisations pay money to IDCARE at present? Not enough. That's the short answer to that question. From New Zealand, we have a few telcos and a few financial institutions. But we're by no means covering the costs it's creating for us to service the country. That's our lot in life as a charity. If you were to get a suspicious phone call, what sort of questions would you ask to find out if they are legitimate? It's not so much questions. This is a good question. It's not so much questions. I think for consumers, the message needs to be identify what's a risky transaction or a risky communication first. So if somebody asks for your personal information, if somebody asks for your financial information, as a consumer, if they've initiated that communication with you, that's a flag for riskiness. And from there, that's where you need to ask questions around, is there an alternative way I can communicate with you? The amygdala dominates with scam telephone calls. It's all about, and phishing emails, it's all about getting a response from an individual without them thinking. And often that's a response based on fear. If it's inland revenue, you owe us tax. If it's the police, you're about to be arrested. If it's the bank, somebody's hacked your account. So it's all about getting that consumer to respond in a way where they're not thinking. So understanding what those risky transactions are, I think, is a very good start. Again, it's got nothing to do with intelligence. How much does the service cost? It's free for people. Why do scammers scam? Are they evil, heartless, or just starving? I'm not sure whether they're starving. They're making a lot of money. No, we've had plenty of conversations with telephone scammers. We call them. And we test the number to make sure it's not spoofed, so to make sure they're not stolen someone else's number, which is increasing as a problem. We've asked a few of them why they're doing it. They said they just need the money. Be very careful if you're someone who likes to give scammers free career advice, particularly if you haven't got your caller ID blocked, because we do see a relationship between people giving abusive feedback to scammers and then them having their phone number spoofed. So what that means is that when they make the next scam phone call to someone, it's your number that appears. So then you're going to get people calling you, wanting to give you free career advice as a result, which is a problem, and we can't do anything about that at the moment. What is your advice to the New Zealand government to prevent scams and look after victims? Talk to us. Talk to us. There's no silver bullet here, people. It changes. I think really understand what the response system's doing to a client and be bold about what you can do about it. Don't just sort of go, it's someone else's job, because it's no one else's job. Do you provide advocacy in schools and education material? Yep, we do. Yep, conversations can't start early enough in the home, and it's not all about the schools. It should be a conversation you're having at the dinner table. Thank you.